If somebody gives you a laptop, like, hey, you can have this, and they forget to wipe the laptop first, and it includes a whole bunch of nude pictures of them, do you think you could just publish those pictures online and say, oh, well, I own the pictures? You don't own the pictures. You don't own the copyright on that digital material. You own the physical device itself. Owning the physical device itself doesn't give you access to, or ownership of, or even a license to redistribute the copyrighted content on that drive. But I don't even know if you disagree with that, or if your mind is just shut off because you so desperately want to believe the narrative that, like, oh, I think they censored the story because I don't like it.
How do you know whether someone's real or not? Like, this is the big argument with Elon and Twitter, because Elon asked Twitter, like, what percentage of your website is filled with bots? And they say 5%. And he says, I don't believe you. I think it's higher. And let's find out how you've come to this conclusion.
Yeah.
And, you know, I believe they said that they just took 100 random Twitter pages and looked at the interaction, and there's some sort of an algorithm they applied to it. But how do you discern?
Yeah, so I mean, I think estimating the overall prevalence is one thing, but I think that the question of looking at a page and is this page authentic, I think that there's a bunch of signals around that. One of the things that we try to do is for large pages, we try to make sure that we know who the admin of that page is. We don't necessarily, if you should be able to run an anonymous page, you don't necessarily need to out yourself and say who you are running it, but we want to make sure that we sort of have like an identity for that person on file, so that way we know, like at least behind the scenes, that that person is real. For certain political things, I think having a sense of what country they're originating from, I mean, some of that you can do just by looking at where their server traffic comes from, like is the IP address coming from Romania, or are
Romanian people not real?
Because if it's like an ad in some other country's election, then you probably want to make sure that that ad is especially in countries that have laws around that, are coming from someone who's a valid citizen, or like at least in that place. So there's a bunch of, I think, I don't know, one theme in my worldview around this stuff, when it gets to some of the stuff that we talked about before, is like, I don't think that this stuff is black and white, or that you're ever going to have like a perfect AI system. I think it's all trade-offs all the way down, right? And you could build a system, and you can either be overly aggressive and capture a higher percent of the bad guys, but then also by accident take out some number of good guys. Or you could be a little more lenient and say, okay, no, the cost of taking out any number of good guys is too high, so we're going to tolerate having just a little bit more, like, more bad guys on the system. These are values questions, right, around what do you value more, and those are super tricky questions. And part of what I've struggled with around this is get into this to basically judge those things. I got into this to design technology that helps people connect, right? It's like, and like, I mean, you could probably tell when we spent the first hour talking about the metaverse and the future of basically building this whole technology roadmap to basically give people this realistic sense of presence. It's like, that's what I'm here to do, right? So this whole thing that's like arbitrating what is okay and what is not, I obviously have to be involved in that, because this is at some level, I run the company, and I can't just abdicate that. But I also don't think that as a matter of governance, you want all of that decision-making vested in one individual. So I think one of the things that our country and our government gets right is the separation of powers. One of the things that I tried to create is, we created this oversight board. It's an independent board that basically we appointed people whose kind of paramount value is free expression, but they also balance that with things like, when is there going to be real harm to others in terms of safety or privacy or other human rights issues. And basically that board, people in our community can appeal cases to when they think that we got it wrong, and that board actually gets to make the final binding decision, not us. So in a way, I actually think that is a more legitimate form of governance than having just a team internally that makes these decisions, or maybe some of them go up to me, although I don't spend a ton of my time on this on a day-to-day basis. I think it's generally good to have some kind of separation of powers where you're architecting the governance, so that way you have different stakeholders and different people who can make these decisions, and it's not just like one private company that's making decisions even about what just happens on our platform.
How do you guys handle things when they're a big news item that's controversial? Like, there was a lot of attention on Twitter during the election because of the Hunter Biden laptop story. The New York
we
Post
had that too.
Yeah, so you guys censored that as well?
So we took a different path than Twitter. Basically the background here is the FBI, I think, basically came to us, some folks on our team, and was like, hey, just so you know, like, you should be on high alert. We thought that there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the 2016 election. We have it on notice that basically there's about to be some kind of dump of that's similar to that. So just be vigilant. So our protocol is different from Twitter's. What Twitter did is they said you can't share this at all. We didn't do that. What we do is we have, if something is reported to us as potentially misinformation, important misinformation, we also have this third-party fact-checking program because we don't want to be deciding what's true and false. And for I think it was 5 or 7 days when it was basically being determined whether it was false, the distribution on Facebook was decreased, but people were still allowed to share it. So you could still share it, you could still consume it.
So when you say the distribution is decreased,
it got shared.
How does that work?
It basically, the ranking in newsfeed was a little bit less. So fewer people saw it than would have otherwise. So it definitely...
By what percentage?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it's meaningful. But basically, a lot of people were still able to share it. We got a lot of complaints that was the case. Obviously this is a hyper-political issue, so depending on what side of the political spectrum, you either think we didn't censor it enough or censored it way too much. But we weren't sort of as black and white about it as Twitter. We just kind of thought, hey, look, if the FBI, which I still view as a legitimate institution in this country, it's like very professional law enforcement, they come to us and tell us that we need to be on guard about something, then I want to take that seriously.
Did they specifically say you need to be on guard about that story?
No, I don't remember if it was that specifically, but it basically fit the pattern.
When something like that turns out to be real, is there regret for not having it evenly distributed and for throttling the distribution of that story?
What do you mean evenly distributed?
I mean evenly in that it's not suppressed. It's not.
Yeah. I mean, it sucks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because it turned out after the fact. The fact checkers looked into it. No one was able to say it was false. Right, so basically it had this period where it was getting less distribution. So yeah, I think I think it sucks though. I think in the same way that probably having to go through like a criminal trial but being proven innocent in the end sucks. Like, it still sucks to have like that you had to go through a criminal trial, but at the end you're free. I don't know if the answer would have been don't do anything or don't have any process. I think the process was pretty reasonable. We still let people share it. But obviously you don't want situations like that. But
certainly much more reasonable than Twitter's stance, and it's probably also the case of armchair quarterbacking, right? Or at least Monday morning quarterbacking, I should say. Because in the moment, you had reason to believe, based on the FBI talking to you, that it wasn't real and that there was going to be some propaganda. So what do you do?
Yeah.
And then if you just let it get out there, and what if it changes the election and it turns out to be bullshit? That's a real problem. I would imagine that those kind of decisions are the most difficult. The decisions of like what is allowed and what is not allowed.
Yeah. What would you do in that situation?
I don't know what I would do. I would have to really...
I think my most frustrating issue with Joe Rogan, because now he sounds reasonable in this conversation. I think I've said this before on stream. My biggest issue with Joe Rogan is it seems like he always agrees with whoever's on his show. So I never can tell like what his position is. So if he has a bunch of like weird conspiracy kooks on his show, then it's just like all weird conspiracy shit. But when he's got somebody reasonable on his show, it's like reasonable stuff, with only one exception, and that's if somebody wants to argue about marijuana. Then he becomes evangelical.
Thoroughly. Well, first of all, you're dealing with the New York Post, which is one of the oldest newspapers in the country. So I would say I would want to talk to someone from the New York Post, and I would say, how did you come up with this data? Like, where are you getting the information from? How do you know whether or not this is correct? Then you have to make a decision, because they might have got duped. It's hard because everybody wants to look at it after the fact. Now that we know that the laptop was real and then it was a legitimate story and there is potential corruption involved with him, we think, oh, that should not have been restricted, that should not have been banned from sharing on Twitter. Right. I think.
Wait, to Zuckerberg. So for the 50 trillionth time, the issue on Twitter was a hacked materials policy, not that it was fake news. there were publications that discussed the laptop that were posting about it on Twitter that didn't get banned. You just couldn't include a link to a website that had hacked materials exposed on it. That was the initial Twitter policy. I think Twitter has since changed that policy, but it's not true to say that regardless if you feel like that was right or wrong, it's not true to say that Twitter was suppressing the entire story. That's not true. Plenty of publications were writing about the story and posting on Twitter and weren't getting banned for it. You just couldn't include a link to hacked materials. That was the point. I mean, and again, you can be against that, but like just present it for what it was.
Everybody agrees with that. Even Twitter agrees with that. But the thing is, then they didn't think that. In the beginning, they thought it was fake. So what do? Like if something comes along and the Republicans cook up some scheme to make it look like Joe Biden's a terrible person, and they only do it so that they can win the election, but it's really just propaganda. What are you supposed to do with that? You're supposed to not allow that to be distributed. So if they think that's the case, it makes sense to me that they would try to stop it. But I just don't think...
Hold on, sorry. There's a guy in chat. Come on, that hacked materials policy, or policy was clearly just pretense. Other hacked materials were never censored and it was not hacked. Number one, it was essentially hacked. It was gotten through ill means. It was not something that was consented to be published, number one. And number two, there were people before that had gotten in trouble for posting hacked materials. It was actually a left-leaning group that had to do with posting, I think it was the docs information of a bunch of police officers that got in trouble, I want to say a few months prior. I'd have to go and find that story, but nobody talked about that one as much. It wasn't just pretense. Because if it was pretense, they would have banned all media publications talking about it, not just the people that were posting to that original, I think it was a New York Post story.
That they looked at it hard enough. When the New York Post is talking about it, they're pretty smart about what they release and what they don't release. If they're going over some data from a laptop and you could talk to a person, but again, like this is just one story, like one individual story. Like how many of these pop up every day, especially in regards to polarizing issues like climate change or COVID or foreign policy or Ukraine. Anytime there's like a really controversial issue where some people think that it's imperative that you take a very specific stance and you can't have the other stance. Mm-hmm. Like those moments on social media, those trouble a lot of people because they don't know why certain things get censored or certain things get promoted. And it's like to be in your spot. And one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about is this, because like to be in your spot must be insanely difficult. To have, no matter what decision you make, you're going to have a giant chunk of people that are upset at you. And there might be a right way to handle it, but I don't know what the right way is.
Well, I think the right way is to establish principles for governance.
Most of the content on the laptop was emails. I could be wrong, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say in that original New York Post story, they were posting pictures of Hunter Biden with women as well. Was that not part of the original, on that original New York Post story? I thought it was. I'd have to go back and look for the original one, but I thought there were some censored pictures of him with some women as well, with Hunter Biden with some women as well.
That try to be balanced and not have the decision-making too centralized. Because I think that it's hard for people...
It was not hacked and there was nothing alluding to it. Your brain is shut the off because you're so politically biased. Hacked materials doesn't mean that it came from a fucking computer hack. It means that there is non-consensual information published from a device where somebody didn't consent for somebody to do so. So like if I were to steal some person's phone and then publish like personal pictures of them and then put that in a news article, that would fall under the Twitter hacked materials policy. It doesn't mean that it was like gotten through like a super ultra hack, somebody ratted somebody's box and got some files of it. It just means that you'd gotten files of a device and then published those without the consent of the person. And then whether or not it's newsworthy enough to reveal personal information, I guess was up to Twitter's discretion. Again, you can take issue with that policy. That's fine. I don't know how to make you understand. I'm sorry. I don't know how to make you understand. I can't do it. I'm telling you, it's okay for you to be upset about the policy. Just be correct when you give the criticism. You can't say they censored the story because it doesn't like it. They didn't like the story. That makes you fucking retarded. Because your view is inconsistent, because plenty of people were talking about that story and had written articles about that story that were published on Twitter that didn't get banned. They didn't get banned. They got caught by the New York Post story originally, got caught by Twitter's hacked material policy. If you don't like that policy, that's fine, say it. But when you say, oh, they just censored the story because they didn't like it, you are engaging in retardation. okay? You are engaging, you are being cognitively biased, you are unable to see the reality of what's before you, and you're not levying your criticism in the correct direction. The correct direction would say, I don't like Twitter's hack material policy. Here are some arguments you could use. Let me help you escape your pit of autism, okay? Here's some arguments you could use. I don't like Twitter's hack material policy because I think there might be newsworthy stories that could be published of somebody that would include hack materials. So I think Twitter's hack material policy has to go. That's one thing. A second thing, I don't like Twitter's hacked material policy because who could be a public figure? That particular part could introduce some bias onto the person making the story, right? It might be the case that I think that Hunter Biden is somebody that is worthy of publishing stories about, and these particular personal photos might be worthy. So I don't like the amount of discretion that goes into the hack materials policy. That could be those two things, right? These are two arguments that you could levy, and those would be perfectly fine arguments. You can have that back and forth. But when you just go online, you're like, I think media censor stories that I don't like. Oh, well, how do you explain all of the other stories about Hunter Biden and his laptop that were published on Twitter that didn't get banned or didn't get taken out? Well, and I already know your next answer. Your next answer is, well, they already, because this is the answer you give for every conspiracy. I know exactly how your brain works. It's the same shit my mom would say. You'd go, oh, well, what happened was the story got so big they knew they couldn't censor it all. So they tried to censor the New York Post one, and then it exploded. Its Streisand effect out of control, and they knew they couldn't fucking ban any others. Right? That's it. And then now you've created like an airtight argument that you can never lose because you've got a perfect conspiracy to explain every single inconsistent thing that could possibly exist. But
to accept that like some team at Meta or that I personally am making all these decisions, and I think people should be skeptical about any like, so much concentration around that. So that's why a lot of the innovation that I've tried to push for in governance is around things like establishing this oversight board. So that way you have people who are luminaries around expression from all over the world, but also in the US. Folks like Michael McConnell, is a Stanford professor.
The guy rightfully owned it due to an agreement Hunter agreed to when he brought the laptop to the repairman. Is that hacked? They're ill-gotten digital files. If somebody gives you a laptop and they say, here, this is your laptop, you can keep, I don't even know why I'm explaining this to you. I can't tell if you actually believe how fucking stupid this is. If somebody gives you a laptop, like, hey, you can have this, and they forget to wipe the laptop first, and it includes a whole bunch of nude pictures of them, do you think you could just publish those pictures online and say, oh, well, I own the pictures? You don't own the pictures. You don't own the copyright on that digital material. You own the physical device itself. Owning the physical device itself doesn't give you access to, or ownership of, or even a license to redistribute the copyrighted content on that drive. And that, like, full stop. But I don't even know if you disagree with that, or if your mind is just shut off because you so desperately want to believe the narrative that, like, oh, I think they censored the story because I don't like it.
If you forfeit the ownership, then it gets sold does not equal hacked. Ask your boy Rossman about his sales of laptops that were never picked up.
Sure, if Rossman wants to come on and fight with it, we can fight over it, but he's going to agree with me 100%, or he's going to be wrong. Just because you sell a laptop to somebody or give a laptop to somebody does not mean that they get access to the copyrighted materials in a way that they can redistribute or republish them. You can't do that. Irk in chat says, to add to what you're saying about the hack materials policy, not only was Blue Leak censored, but DDoS Secrets that posted the story didn't hack it. They just shared it and they got their account banned. New York Post not only got unbanned, but Twitter literally changed the rules for them. So New York Post actually got special treatment. They did censor it because they didn't like the political backlash. Okay, have fun, buddy. See you later. Imagine thinking social media companies don't censor stories they don't like or have a clear political bias. Nice, good one, dude. Sorry, Destiny, I don't quite trust your legal takes. Where's a lawyer? I can bring in a lawyer to talk about copyright if you want. Do you really think so? Do you really disagree with this argument? Are you actually that dumb? Ultimately, this is even for the Supreme Court found that cell phone is entirely unlike a typical container, for instance, a cigarette pack. Sure, both might contain evidence, but that evidence is physical and one instance digital. The other, and the digital evidence itself, when told, is both vast and tremendously personal. Today's smartphones, blah, blah, blah. This quote explained data revealed by cell phone may not actually be stored on it with cloud computing. Like, police even need a separate search warrant to search your phone. Like, if I buy somebody's laptop and it's got personal pictures on it, do I have a right to publish those pictures on the internet?